You want to know the exact moment I realized my own flesh and blood had turned into a pack of wolves? Well, it was 2:47 in the morning, when the sound of a crowbar meeting my back patio door echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. And I knew right then that the life I spent 50 years building was under siege from the inside. It was exactly 13 minutes to 3 when the glass gave way, and I could tell right off. It wasn't just some branch hitting the house or a plate falling off a shelf, because that sound had a cold kind of purpose behind it, and I'd eventually find that heavy iron tool lying on my kitchen tile like a signed confession from a person who didn't care, who knew they were there. I just sat up in the dark and held my breath as two voices drifted up the stairs, and I recognized them immediately, because one was my own daughter, and the other was the man she'd chosen to marry, and they were trying to be quiet, but in a house that's supposed to be sleeping a whisper. Carrie's just as loud as a shout. When my daughter told him to just get the files from the office because they only needed the original documents, I didn't move an inch or make a sound, because at 71 years old, I was just sitting there in the blackness listening to my own child commit a felony against me. And the truly pathetic part of the whole deal was that I wasn't even shocked. Since I'd been expecting this play for a long time, my name is Michael Donovan, and I came up in a hard coal town in the eastern part of Kentucky where you either lived your life underground or you got out while you still had lungs that worked, and I chose the latter path when I was 16 years old, hitchhiking all the way to Louisville with nothing but $40 and a bag of clothes that were 2 sizes too big for my skinny frame. I spent my first 3 nights sleeping in a church parking lot until a kind pastor found me and let me live in the basement as long as I kept the place spotless, so I spent my youth mopping floors and fixing pipes, and I learned real quick that there isn't a job in this world that's beneath a man, if it puts food on the table. By the time I hit 20, I was swinging a hammer on construction sites, and by 25 I had my license, and by 30 I opened up Caldwell Construction with a single beat-up bulldozer and a loan that the bank manager thought was a joke. But he wasn't laughing. 10 years later, when I walked in and paid that debt off in full while opening a second office, I went on to build the schools, and the clinics, and the shopping centers that make up half of 3 different counties. Not because I was the smartest guy in the room, but because I worked harder than any man I ever met, and I never once cut a corner. Because my name was the only foundation I had, I married a woman named Margaret Donovan when I was 26, and she was a teacher with a laugh that could light up the dark and a backbone just as stiff as mine, and we raised 2 kids named Olivia. Donovan and Ryan Donovan in a home that was probably a lot nicer than the one I grew up in, and I gave them every single thing I never had, from private schools to brand new cars, and I thought I was setting them up for success, but I see now I was just feeding their sense of entitlement. Margaret Donovan passed away 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and it took her so fast it made my head spin. Because in just 8 weeks, I went from having a partner to standing in a graveyard, watching them bury the only woman I ever gave a damn about. And after that, the house just felt empty and cold, and I kept working, because it was the only thing I knew how to do, even if the heart was gone out of it. My son, Ryan Donovan, was always a good man who worked at the bank and never asked for a cent, and he'd come over to mow the lawn and sit on the porch with me, and we didn't need to say much to understand each other. But Olivia Donovan was always hungry for more, and she married a guy named Daniel Whitmore who called himself a financial advisor. But really, he was just a shark in a tailored suit who knew how to steal your watch while he was telling you the time. Margaret Donovan never did like him, and she told me once that he looked at our family like a contractor looks at a house he's about to tear down, and I should have listened to her back then, because after she was gone, the mask started to slip, and Olivia Donovan started asking about what the company was worth, and Victor was always offering to look at my money as a favor, and they kept hinting that maybe 70 was too old to be running a business, as if my brain had turned to mush just because my hair turned gray. Then things got real ugly about 6 months ago when I went into the office on a Saturday when nobody was supposed to be there, and I saw Victor's car parked in the back, so I snuck in the side door and heard them upstairs talking to some woman who was explaining how to document a pattern of mental decline so they could take me to court and get a conservatorship, which would basically turn me into a legal child and freeze all my accounts while they sold my company to some national corporation. and I stood there in the dark, feeling a rage that felt like it came from the very bottom of a coal mine because my own daughter was planning to bury me alive for a paycheck. So I walked out of that building without a word and sat in my truck until I could breathe again. And then I went home and called a lawyer named Charles Mercer, who was a 73-year-old bulldog that had survived cancer and bad marriages and was still the meanest fighter I knew, and I told him every bit of it, and he told me straight up that this wasn't just some family spat but a full-blown war, and I told him I was ready to fight it until the very end. This is a hostile takeover using the legal system as a weapon, and if we don't move fast, they will bury you. Then we move fast. First thing, get evaluated. I want 3 independent neurological exams from doctors who have no connection to your family. We need bulletproof documentation that you are mentally sharp. I am mentally sharp. I know that. Now we need a judge to know it. I took those evaluations the following week. 3 different neurologists. Hours of testing. Memory, reasoning, problem-solving, executive function. Every single result came back the same. Michael Donovan shows no signs of cognitive impairment. His mental acuity is consistent with a high-functioning individual decades younger. I kept those reports in a safe that nobody but Ed and I knew about. The second thing I did was call Anthony Russo. Frank and I had been friends since the early days. He was a plumber who became a real estate developer who became one of the wealthiest men in the state. More importantly, Frank was loyal. Loyal the way men are when they've been through hard times together. I told him what was happening. "You need witnesses," Frank said immediately. "People in your corner who can testify that you're sharp, that you're competent, that nobody's pushing you around. I also need eyes on my company. Victor's already been inside the building. I don't know what he's been doing. Then let me make some calls." Frank did more than make calls. He brought in a forensic accountant, a woman named Laura Bennett, who had spent 20 years at the FBI investigating white-collar crime before going private. I gave her access to everything, every account, every ledger, every contract, and I told her one thing. Follow the money. Wherever it goes, whatever you find, I want to know. What Patricia found made me sick. Olivia Donovan and Victor had been bleeding me for 3 years. Not from the construction company directly. They were smarter than that. They had been accessing my personal investment accounts. Victor, using his position as my financial advisor, had been making trades, moving money between accounts, setting up fees and commissions that went directly to a separate LLC registered in Victor's brother's name. Small amounts at first. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, always disguised as management fees, advisory charges, rebalancing costs. Over 3 years, they had siphoned nearly $780,000. $780,000. Money I earned pouring foundations in January, sweating through August heat, working weekends while my competitors were on the golf course, stolen by a man who shook my hand every Sunday at dinner and called me Dad. But that wasn't the worst of it. Patricia also discovered that Victor had been in contact with Ashford National Builders, the company that wanted to buy Caldwell Construction. Emails going back 18 months, preliminary valuations, draft acquisition terms. They had already agreed on a price, $14.2 million for the whole operation. The plan was simple. Get the conservatorship, gain legal control, sell the company, split the money, and leave me sitting in some facility watching game shows while they lived off my life's work. When I saw those emails, I sat in my study and cried for the first time since Margaret Donovan's funeral. Not because of the money, because of the betrayal. Because my daughter had sat across from me at Christmas dinner, held my hand during Olivia Donovan, and told me she loved me while her husband was negotiating the sale of everything I owned. For 2 months, I said nothing. I went to Sunday dinners. I let Victor review my accounts. I smiled when Olivia Donovan told me I should think about retiring. I played the role of the trusting old man perfectly. But behind the scenes, I was building my case like I build my buildings. One beam at a time. Solid. Level. Unbreakable. Ed restructured my will. The old one was torn up. The new one was specific, detailed, and ruthless. Any family member who attempted to challenge my competency would be automatically disinherited. Every penny, no exceptions. I created an irrevocable trust for the company. 7 trustees, all handpicked. Longtime employees, Frank, Ed, people whose loyalty I had earned over decades. To sell the company, you needed unanimous consent from all 7. Victor could file all the conservatorship papers he wanted. It wouldn't matter. The company was locked in a vault he couldn't crack. I also quietly changed all my passwords. Every financial account, every email, every system. Victor's access was revoked without notification. He wouldn't know until he tried to log in, and by then, it would be too late. Then I changed the locks on my house. New deadbolts, new security system, cameras at every entrance, every window, recording 24 hours a day, because I knew what was coming. I had built things my entire life. I understood foundations. And I understood that when you pull the foundation out from under someone who thought they were standing on solid ground, they don't negotiate. They attack. The night I chose to reveal everything was calculated. I invited Olivia Donovan and Victor for dinner on a Wednesday. Just the 3 of us. I told them I wanted to discuss my retirement plans, that I had been thinking about stepping back from the company, that I wanted their input. Olivia Donovan practically floated through the door. She was beaming. Victor had a bottle of expensive wine, the kind you bring when you think you're about to close a deal. I cooked Margaret Donovan's pot roast recipe. We sat at the dining room table, the same table where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays for 20 years. We talked about the weather, about Sophie Donovan's soccer team, about a trip Olivia Donovan wanted to take to Italy. Normal things, family things. After dessert, I set my coffee cup down and looked at both of them. I know what you've been doing. 4 words. The room went cold. Victor smiled, the reflex of a man who cons people for a living. What do you mean, Arthur? I opened a folder I'd placed under my chair before they arrived. Bank statements, the LLC filings, Patricia's forensic report, Victor's emails with Ashford National Builders, screenshots of the conservatorship consultation with the woman whose name turned out to be Dr. Rebecca Sloan, a psychologist who specialized in elder competency cases and who, it turned out, had lost her license in another state for falsifying evaluations. I laid those papers out one by one, like a man showing a winning hand at the end of a long poker game, and I watched the color just drain right out of Olivia Donovan's face while she stared at those documents as if they were going to turn into a fire. Right there on the table, she tried to tell me there was an explanation for it all, but I shut that down quick by telling her I'd heard every single word they said about the conservatorship and the sale of my company while I was standing right there in the hallway. Victor's fake salesman smile just dropped away and his jaw went tight, but I didn't give him an inch to breathe. I told him exactly how much he'd stolen from me and that I had a former FBI agent's report to back up every penny of that $780,000 he'd siphoned off through his brother's company. Olivia Donovan started that loud, kind of panicked crying. You hear from people who realize the floor just fell out from under them, and I made it real clear that the will was changed. The company was locked in a trust they couldn't touch, and if they ever stepped foot near my business or my home again, I was handing the whole folder over to the district attorney to let them handle the fraud and embezzlement charges. Victor nearly knocked his chair over when he stood up and tried to claim they were still family, but I told him they stopped being my kin the second they started treating me like a paycheck, and I told them both to get out of my house right then and there. The way Victor slammed that front door, I thought the whole frame was going to crack, and after their car went screaming down the driveway, a kind of silence settled into the house that felt heavy and permanent, like something had been broken that could never be fixed again. And I honestly figured that would be the end of the story. But I was dead wrong because exactly 2 weeks later at nearly 3 a.m, they came back through the sliding glass door with a crowbar in their hands only. They didn't know that my old friend Anthony Russo had been bunking in my guest room for 10 days, because my lawyer Ed had warned me that desperate people do desperate things when they're cornered. Frank has been a light sleeper since his time over in Vietnam, and he was standing in my bedroom doorway, fully dressed before the glass even stopped falling, telling me to stay put while he called the police. We stood at the top of those stairs and listened to my own daughter tearing through my office drawers looking for the files she thought would save her skin, while Victor was cursing and trying to pry open my safe with that iron bar, and that was when I flipped on the lights and walked down to face them with Frank right behind me recording every bit of it on his phone. Olivia Donovan froze like a deer in headlights with my tax returns and property deeds in her shaking hands, and I told her to put them down, while Frank warned Victor that he'd better drop that crowbar unless he wanted to add an assault charge to the breaking and entering. He was already looking at, and once the red and blue lights started flashing through the broken patio door, I walked out onto the porch and watched the officers put my firstborn child into the back of a squad car, while she begged me to tell them it was all just a big misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding at all. It was just the final stop on a 3-year road of greed. And I spent the rest of that night sitting in my office looking at an old picture of me and Margaret Donovan on our wedding day, wondering how we got from that happy morning to this mess. The next few days were a blur of news, headlines, and town gossip, since everyone knows the Caldwell name around here, and my son, Ryan Donovan, came by to sit at the kitchen table and ask if I was doing okay. And even though he was heartbroken about his sister, he told me straight out that I was right to protect what I'd built, even if it meant she had to face the music herself. When the legal dust finally started to settle, Victor's high-priced lawyer tried every trick in the book to make me look like a paranoid old man who'd lost his marbles, but Ed was ready for them, and he laid those neurological reports on the judge's desk like a hammer, because 3 different doctors had already sworn I was as sharp as a tack, and with Patricia's forensic report showing exactly where the money went, the judge wasn't interested in hearing any more of Victor's lies about why they were in my house at 3 a.m. with a crowbar. Justice is a bitter pill to swallow when you have to hand it to your own flesh and blood, but I've learned the hard way that a foundation built on a lie will never stand up to the wind, no matter how much money you pour into the cracks. That forensic accountant lady didn't miss a single beat, and she tracked down every crooked fee and shell company those two had set up to bleed me dry, while Victor's own emails were the final nails in his coffin, and the district attorney's office decided to slap him with wire fraud on top of everything else. Then Olivia Donovan's lawyer came around with a deal saying she'd admit to trespassing and pay back her part of the stolen cash as long as she only saw me when someone was watching and I'd drop the heavy felony charges, and when my lawyer Ed asked me what I wanted to do, I just looked out the window at the roses. Margaret Donovan used to tend, and told him I wanted my daughter back, but not the woman she'd turned into, so I told her if she owned up to, if everything in front of a judge and went to counseling, I'd think about it. She went ahead and did it too, standing there in that courtroom admitting she'd helped her husband rob her own father, and tried to have me locked away while I sat in the back and made sure she felt my eyes on her the whole time because she needed to see the cost of her choices. Victor didn't get any kind of mercy, and he ended up losing at trial and getting 4 years for fraud and embezzlement. And standing there in his expensive suit, he didn't look like a man in charge anymore, but just like the common thief he always was. Olivia Donovan filed for divorce that same week and moved into a little place on the east side while taking a regular job at a dentist's office, which was the first time she'd really worked in 15 years, and she didn't ask me for a single penny. 2 months went by before she finally called me up with a voice that sounded a lot smaller and more honest, asking if she could come see me, and when she showed up on a Sunday afternoon, she looked older and was just wearing regular clothes like jeans and a sweater, instead of the designer stuff she used to flaunt. We sat on the porch where Margaret Donovan and I used to watch the storms, and she didn't try to make any excuses but told me she was just terrified of losing her safety net after her mama died, and Victor used that fear to lead her down a dark road until she didn't even know who she was anymore. I told her that her mother always believed people could change even if I was a man who put my trust in things like concrete and steel that don't change on you, but I said I was willing to try and build something new with her as long as it was honest. And she told me Sophie Donovan missed me. So I told her the door was always open. Even if the new locks and cameras were still running that night, Ryan Donovan brought his family over for a steak dinner, and even though things felt almost normal, the empty chairs reminded us of what we'd lost. But Ryan Donovan told me I did the right thing and reminded me that doing what's right doesn't always feel good, which made me realize I'd at least raised him right, because he understood what it meant to do the hard work, even when it rains. Then a month later, I got a letter from Sophie Donovan in purple ink asking if she could come over to build a birdhouse, and we spent that Saturday in the garage where she worked with a look in her eye that was pure Margaret Donovan. We hung that blue birdhouse in the oak tree, and I felt a bit of hope for the first time in a long while because even though some things stay broken, you can always start building something new. And today, I'm just sitting here in my study, knowing the company is solid and my future is finally in safe hands. You might think the hardest part of a war is the fighting itself, but the real work starts when the guns go silent and you're left standing in the ruins of a home you don't quite recognize anymore. The board is running a lot smoother these days now that my son Ryan Donovan has started coming to the meetings and really digging into the business from the ground up, just like I always wanted for his sister and Olivia Donovan, and I still make a point to have lunch once a month, even though the air between us is still pretty thick, and we have to be real careful about what we say. We don't talk about the night, the glass broke, or the court cases. Instead, we stick to safe topics like the weather or how Sophie Donovan is doing in school, because we're trying to rebuild this family one brick at a time, and you have to make sure that foundation is solid before you even think about putting the walls back up. Some nights I still find myself sitting out on the porch and having a long talk with Margaret Donovan, telling her all about the grandkids and the business and that blue birdhouse we hung up in the oak tree. And I tell her I'm sorry. I couldn't keep everyone together the way she always could, but in the silence of the night, I swear I can hear her voice telling me that I did my level best, and that's all any of us can really do in this life. Now, I want to say one thing to anyone out there who's getting on in years and starting to feel like the world is trying to shove you out the door. If someone tells you that your time is up, or that you should just step aside and let someone else take over what you built, you look them right in the eye and you tell them no, because those gray hairs and aching joints aren't a sign that you're finished. They're the proof that you survived and that you never stopped showing up year after year, and nobody in this world gets to take your dignity because it was never theirs to begin with. My name is Michael Donovan, and I built this life with my own 2 hands, and I'm still here standing tall and still building, and if that isn't enough to prove I've earned my place, then nothing ever will be. But there is one thing I've kept to myself this whole time because, while the police think it was just a desperate break in the truth, is I'm the one who left that crowbar on the back porch, and I was the one who sent that anonymous email to Victor telling him the safe combination was hidden in my desk, because I had to know for sure if my own daughter would really choose the money over her own father. And now that I finally have my answer, I can sleep in peace, knowing exactly where everyone stands.